Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Carol Glasser, and I'm currently the chair of the ASA, American Sociological Association Community for Community Engaged Scholars and Teachers. We're hosting this event, and today's event is talking about tenure and promotion when you do community engaged scholarship and how to put that into your tenure and promotion files. I'm really excited about today's event because we have two people who are going to present who were really instrumental in helping put together ASA's new guidelines on tenure and promotion for scholars as well as those making decisions about tenure and promotion to use. ASA's new toolkit is called How to Include Community Engaged Scholarship in the Tenure and Promotion Process. And I'll put a link to that in the chat. So I'm going to let each of our speakers, Dr. Rebecca London and Dr. Mark Warren, introduce themselves. But I just wanted to give a plug for all the amazing work that they've done. Dr. London has also worked to make tenure and promotion guidelines for UC Santa Cruz that take into account community engaged work. So we have some people who have really been at the forefront of this work, and we're really lucky to have them here today. Today's format is going to be a presentation by Dr. London and Dr. Warren for about half of the time. We ask that you hold your questions during that time, but you can feel free to use the chat actively, and I'll be moderating the chat. And then towards the second half, we'll open it up for question and answer. And during that period of time, we've kept this in a meeting format rather than a webinar so that you can see each other's faces. You can use the hand raising signal, or you could type in the chat and I'll moderate the Q&A for Dr. Warren and Dr. London. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to today's speakers, who are the people you actually came here to hear from.
All right. Well, thank you, Carol. Appreciate your sponsoring of this webinar. I'm happy to be here with Rebecca to talk about these new guidelines. My name is Mark Warren. I am a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I've been doing community engaged scholarship and research for 30 years now, actually. And a lot of my work is in deep partnership with community organizing groups, working in communities of color around educational justice and racial equity issues and community liberation. I've also been someone who's been very involved in trying to help build the field of community engaged scholarship in sociology and also in education research, where I'm also active. So I helped found something called the Urban Research-Based Action Network about 13 years ago, which Rebecca is currently involved with, and I see Greg Squires here has been involved with us as well. And so I mention these things because I believe that the adoption by the American Sociological Association of guidelines for including community engaged scholarship and tenure and promotion is a really momentous mark of the growing importance, value, and really acceptance also of this kind of research in sociology and other disciplines. There's a long tradition of this work. One might even say going back to W.B. Du Bois, and there's global tradition, global South and Northern traditions, and the field has kind of ebbed and flowed over the time. But it has always struggled for a full acceptance in the academic disciplines. And I'd say that 20 years ago, Michael Burroway gave a presidential address on public sociology, and a task force was actually formed, chaired by Phil Nyden, and I believe Greg Squires was part of that task force. And they were advocating for inclusion in tenure and promotion as well as other things, and could not get council to agree to adopt guidelines at that time. So 20 years later, we find that council is willing unanimously to support and adopt these guidelines. So I feel it's a very important part of the growth of this movement. Many people do this work inside and outside the academy. But if you decide to do the work inside the academy, as I have, and I think everyone on this call has, then we need to also be able to build and advance our careers. But also, I think we have a larger vision and mission that the kind of research that can come out through community engaged research, as well as the kind of teaching and the kind of practice that came out through it is really important contributions to knowledge, to research, and to scholarship. That community-based wisdom, community-based experience and theory, if you will, also play a very important role. And really what we would like to get to is a point where, you know, social science research and community-based wisdom, knowledge, and experience can come together to develop a deeper understanding and a more solutions-oriented understanding and practice to support communities who are struggling for social justice and social change. So that's a little bit my introductory remarks. Now we have a very practical toolkit and guidelines that I think we can try to implement in a way that would support early career graduate students and early career scholars in getting tenure and then promotion doing this kind of work. So I'm just going to share my screen if I can, just to put up on the screen the website where the guidelines are posted. I think you can see that. So, and I think that Carol may be putting in the chat a link to that. And let me say that I'm proud to be a contributor and a co-author of these guidelines, but I'd like to recognize that Rebecca London, who you're going to hear from next, was really the person who took the lead for our Sociologist Action Network in doing this. And so I want to appreciate her role, as well as the role of other members of the Sociology Action Network, as well as Heather Washington and the ASA, because in part the guidelines emerged also from a project that they led and was supported by the W2 Grant Foundation. So also to recognize them for their vision to advance this kind of field of work within the academy. So there were multiple points to come together. By the way, the ASA project was also piloted, I believe, with George Washington University and a couple of other universities. So multiple routes, multiple hands into these guidelines, which I think has made them, you know, richer and useful. So there's a lot of material on this website. So we're giving you an introduction. We're going to answer some of your questions, but I urge you to go there and look at these materials more closely, because we're only going to be able to, you know, sketch through them, and also to look at all the resources that are there. Now, amongst all these guidelines, I'd like to focus at least briefly on two of them. And the first is the toolkit and guidelines to incorporate community engaged scholarship and your tenure and promotion. And I would like to say that, first of all, I think that losing these guidelines, not just at the time that you're coming up for tenure, but from the very beginning, when you're a graduate student, when you're getting hired, makes sense, because this should not be something that you are now trying to deal with right at the time of getting tenure. It should be a conversation and also a statement about the kind of work that you plan to do in your application to get a position, as well as a conversation with your chair and personnel committee people all along the way to understand the work that you're doing. We also talk about this as in different parts. So we have research. I'm skimming through just to show you teaching and service. We also talk about the integration of this, right? So when you are thinking about writing your statement, you normally they're divided into research, teaching, and service, as you may know. And this could be tenure. This could also be promotion to full. But I think many of us who do this work understand that it's really integrating across these domains that even provides a deeper and richer work in each of them. Nevertheless, the rubber really seems to meet the road on the question of research. So I do think that we do have guidelines on teaching. We do have guidelines on service. Please take a look at those. But I think that in general, doing community engaged teaching or community engaged service is more has been traditionally more accepted anyway, and it's been the struggle around getting credit for the research that you're doing, because as we know, first of all, it takes a lot longer to do this kind of work. It may be richer, better, more accountable to marginalized communities and those struggling for change, but takes time to build relationships, to build trust, to build the partnerships that really can carry this work. And secondly, um, the products, if you will, of this research, as you know, are not just peer-reviewed journal articles, but could also be a whole variety of policy-oriented reports, blogs, curriculum, advocacy materials, reports, research reports geared for use of community-based organizations. And so we are advocating that a number of things here that you define your what you mean by your scholarship, articulate your goals, showcasing your publications, describing your methodologies, and including the process. So we believe that it's not just the output of this work, but the demonstration of the building of mutually respectful and collaborative partnerships, perhaps those that also address issues of power and privilege, as you know, as myself as a white male sociologist is very concerned with in the work that I do, as well as presenting evidence of impact. So there's a lots of elements here that we talk about, including connecting to institutional priorities, because in fact, most higher ed institutions do have as part of their mission contributing to and serving communities in which they're located, whether at local, national, or international levels. And so making those connections, I think, can be very important. I also want to say that we do very much emphasize that community engaged research is about knowledge production. It is about knowledge production. It's a way to produce knowledge, and it's not inferior to or secondary to other ways of producing knowledge. It is, some of our point of view, it's even a more rigorous way of doing it. But in any case, it's an equally valid approach as many others are. And I think so we want to emphasize that. The other thing, I think I'm going to move because I don't want to spend too much time on this. So there are your guidelines if you're going up for um, tenure or promotion. And then we spent a lot of time trying to work on guidelines for reviewers, whether that's a personnel committee or a external reviewers. And this we believe is very important because I think more and more faculty are open to valuing and including community engaged scholarship, but many of these more, let us say, more traditional sociologists don't know how to evaluate it. And I do hear a lot like, we would like to incorporate this, but we don't know how to evaluate it. So these guidelines, I think, are helpful, and we hope they are helpful for personnel committees, but also for external reviewers. Now, your statement going up for review, I think, has to make a lot of these arguments and a lot of these connections. But, we also have a number of, I'm not sure if we want to call these criteria, but areas of a review. What forms did the community engaged research take? The question of partnerships, how are they built? Alignment with goals, impact, contribution to knowledge, how the research was disseminated. And I think there's a couple things that we articulate strongly here. Well, I'll mention two things. First of all, that letters should be solicited from community partners if at all possible. So in other words, where are we going to get the evidence of the nature of the partnerships that was built, its value and impact, value for the community and impact? Well, community partners are well placed to document that kind of contribution. And so we should definitely be soliciting letters from community partners. And we say, if at all possible, it could be the case that in some cases, the community partners don't have the capacity to do this kind of thing. So there may be some equity concerns, but we believe that in most cases they would. And so they should definitely be solicited. That's not normally done. These are not service letters. These are letters concerning scholarship. And they could also be service letters, but we want to emphasize that they're also scholarship letters or could be teaching letters. And the second, that the personnel committee should solicit letters from external reviewers who are experts in community engaged scholarship. So who is qualified in the expertise of evaluating the work of a community engaged scholar? Well, there could be a number of people, but one set that we believe is very important is that the committee reach out, the personnel committee reach out to those people who are expert in doing community engaged scholarship and really understand it. And that is not, of course, always done. They don't have to be the only people that are solicited, but we want to stress that that happens too. So I'm going to, I think, try to wrap up my remarks now to give Rebecca some time. But I guess I want to just say in closing that uh, we really hope that these guidelines are embraced and are used. We welcome feedback and questions from those who are coming up to candidacy as well. There may be people on this call who are on personnel committees or who are in administrative roles in higher ed institutions, again, trying to learn how to how to evaluate it. And we welcome, your feedback and questions so that we can continue to expand this work that we believe is very critical to building the field. We need a new generation of people who now can get positions and can get tenure and get promoted while holding true to their mission of working really in deep partnership with marginalized communities really struggling for social justice, all the more important as we know in the current era that we're in. So thank you very much. I'll pass it over to Rebecca.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Carol, for organizing us. My name is Rebecca London, and I'm a professor of sociology at UC Santa Cruz and the director of a center called Campus Plus Community, which is devoted to supporting community engagement across our campus, not just in sociology, but everywhere. And just a tiny bit of background and history. I had a 20-year career outside of academia before I became an assistant professor in a sociology department. And I feel like that time prior to coming to UC Santa Cruz helped me to understand the importance of community engagement, in part because sometimes I was doing work that just felt off to me. I was a professional evaluator for the first job out of my career, out of my PhD, and I recognized in some of those projects that the questions that I was asking were not the ones that the people who I was talking to wanted to answer. And so I've written about this. ASA published an issue of Footnotes, which is their public-facing magazine, a few years ago, and I wrote about it. I just put the link in the chat if you want to see a little more about where I come from. But when I talk to people about community engagement, I always say this is not the easier way to go, right? If you want to be an academic, don't pick community engaged scholarship as the easiest path. It is the harder path for all kinds of reasons, but the people, as you know, who do this work feel called to it. There's not another way for us to do it. We believe so strongly in epistemic justice and the importance of collaborating deeply with our community partners to create a mutual research agenda that is actionable and solutions oriented, that there's just not another way to do the work. And that's where I come out of. So I am fortunate enough to be one of the grantees of the Institutional Challenge Grant from the William T. Grant Foundation. My program officer and friend, Jenny Irons, is on the call. And as part of that work, one of the things that we said we would do for institutional change was to work on tenure and promotion guidelines at UC Santa Cruz. And so the very first thing we did was we wrote guidelines just for our sociology department. Steve McKay, my colleague, and I worked on those together. And then from there, Santa Cruz is a really already community engaged campus. And we have so many people doing so much different work in collaboration with community across the campus, not just in social sciences, but in arts and humanities, and even in engineering and physical sciences. There's a lot of engagement, public engagement and community engagement in a deeper collaborative way. And so our campus was kind of ripe for this, and there was a lot of support across campus from different factions. And I worked really closely with our Vice Provost for Academic Affairs to join our UC-wide community engagement network, the University of California. We have a community engagement network. It's a few years old. And he learned so much through that process that he was willing to spearhead these guidelines, and we were able to pass them through at the same time that ASA was working with William T. Grant, with funds from William T. Grant Foundation and 3 different DC-based universities to pilot what would it look like to incorporate community engagement into the tenure and promotion process. So all of these things kind of came together, and then I was invited to be part of the Sociology Action Network, and then I was invited to chair it, and then I said, let's write these guidelines. And people were like, oh, I don't know, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't, but we did, and we were we had a receptive council, and so they approved them, and here we are. It's an exciting moment, I will say, for those of us who really believe deeply in this work, because we want, I'm a full professor now. I can kind of do what I want, but I want my junior colleagues to be able to do the work that they feel called to do and get recognition for it. So, so I think that's really where these guidelines come in. For many years, I maybe even told people myself that community engagement isn't something you want to do as a graduate student or as an early career scholar, because you won't get recognition for it, you won't get a job, you won't get promoted. And we're trying to change that paradigm. We want people to be able to do the research that they feel called to do, no matter where they are in their academic trajectory. Okay, so with that intro, I am going to share my screen. Hold on, I have my presentation set to the wrong page to start. So let me just put it to the right page. And now I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an example of how you might incorporate your community engaged scholarship into your tenure and promotion materials. Everybody's campus works a little bit differently in terms of how your materials are reviewed. One thing I will say is that it isn't a bad idea to do a little education in your personal statement if you think that either your department or your dean or your personnel committee at the Senate level or your, whoever approves it at the highest ends, if they don't understand community engagement, it's never a bad idea to say, let me explain to you what this means, and let me tell you that my discipline has approved these guidelines, and this is how my research should be read and reviewed. I find people are sometimes uncomfortable doing that, but I think being really clear, this is how my discipline wants my research to be reviewed. I think that's a really important part of your materials as you're going to submit them. So the first thing I'll say is it's important to align your research with your university's strategic plan or mission statement. I just pulled 3 here they happen to all be public institutions. I'm not sure why that is, but 3 here that are pretty clear. So at the University of New Mexico, their mission statement says, we're rooted in our commitment to serve and elevate our local and global communities. We champion active collaboration, innovative learning, and purpose-driven endeavors. If I were a faculty member at the University of New Mexico, I would, quote that directly in my personal statement. I would say I'm doing exactly these things through my teaching, through my research, elevating our local communities, actively collaborating, creating new and innovative learning opportunities for students. I think if you use those words, it's hard to not value. At the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, it's part of their strategic planning goal. They have a regional community engagement goal to enhance and expand regional and community engagement. That's open to interpretation. I think you interpret it in the ways that favor your approach to expanding, enhancing community engagement, but I think any community engaged scholarship would fit directly into that goal. UCLA has done some incredible work to promote community engagement, both through its strategic plan and its mission. But the mission statement says civic engagement is fundamental to our mission as a public university. We seek to serve society through both teaching and scholarship. So serving society, I think, is the key words there. And so I would encourage you, look and see, what does your university have to say about community engagement in its fundamental materials, and can you link your particular approach to that mission. I think most of us can, or many of us can in some way or another, and we should make sure we mention that so that people know how to evaluate our work. Okay. I have a QR code here, but Carol put the link in the chat already. You know, when these guidelines came out, ASA Director Heather Washington sent out an email and thanked some of the authors of the guidelines by name, including me. And I have never before been asked to write like a personnel review for somebody. I've only been a professor for 9 years, but this year I got 5 requests. So I think that this strategy of making sure you have people who understand community engagement review your file is really important. And the people who requested, you know, who maybe put my name forward are not people who study necessarily content-wise what I study, but the approaches were relevant. And so I didn't agree to do all 5 because that's a lot, but I did a few of them. And one in one, this is what I wrote. I wrote community engagement again as a education for the reviewers, and also to just align the person I was reviewing with what the ASA is saying. Community engagement is a methodological approach that involves building deep connections with community partner to foster the research process from question development to dissemination. The American Sociological Association has recently released guidance for evaluating tenure and promotion, which involves assessment of quality, significance, broader impacts, and dissemination with relevant publics in mind. On all of these criteria, I find Professor X's work to be exemplary. So just to say, I don't just reference the guidance, but I actually pulled out the 3 criteria, right? That it involves an assessment of quality, significance, and broader impacts, and dissemination with relevant publics in mind to really say, these are the criteria we're using for evaluating people's scholarship. If you need a little bit more detail than that, I give you this chart. This comes out of an article that Carol and I wrote with our, at the time, Sociology Action Network colleagues that was aligning community engagement with Michael Bourgois' concept of public sociology. The citations at the bottom, but we put together this chart to help us identify the components, what makes community engagement so special. I think this also helps us to think about how we're going to evaluate it so that there's reciprocity and mutual benefit, there's ethics and a commitment to joint knowledge production, there's a social justice and community action component. This work is interdisciplinary and often multi-methods, and that it could involve a variety of organizational partners, nonprofits, public agencies, local, national, international, across the board. So just to say, there's a lot of ways that you can enact community engagement, and if it helps you to think about them in the context of these 5 buckets, I guess I would call them, you know, I would feel free to use this in any way you like. So in thinking about what you would put in your file, I have sort of traditionally what you would put in your file if you were coming up for tenure or promotion, a merit review, and then what you would do for community engaged scholarship. And I say do both. This is not an either or, this is a both and. Nobody's saying as a community engaged scholar, you're not still publishing in journal articles and writing books and all the things that you would normally do. That's why this is a harder road, because you're doing both. You're both publishing and writing for scholarly audiences, and also as part of your ethical process, you're working deeply with your research partners and you're presenting your findings through the venues that make the most sense to them. That might be a presentation, it could be a report, it could be a website, it could be something, an event, it could be some completely different way of sharing information than is traditional in academia. And so you need to make sure you've included both. I don't think the ASA guidelines are saying, because you're a community engaged scholar, you don't have to publish in academic journals. We're saying you have to still do the scholarly activities that the discipline traditionally demands. And on top of that, we want to recognize the other important ways that you're sharing your research findings back with your community, the people who helped contribute. They're not your research findings, they're your joint research findings, the people who helped contribute to the work. So I think we all know what the traditional things are that we would include, but in your community engaged research part of it, you could talk about your partner, what their missions are, how you partnered with them, how long, for in what purposes, any kind of methodological innovations that you use. For instance, participatory action research or youth participatory action research, those are often things that are much more intensive in terms of data collection and working directly in community. Those are research approaches, and you should get credit for them as research, not as service. And then any evidence of impact. And when Mark was talking about soliciting letters from your community partners, I think about those as impact letters, right? They're research impact letters or teaching impact letters. And so they belong in those categories as research impact or teaching impact. So how can you describe your evidence of impact? Are there any public-facing publications or presentations or any changes in policy and practice, even if those changes happen later, like the report came out and 5 years later there's a policy change, like you could include that and say, this is new, this is a new evidence of my research impact, even though the article or whatever came out 5 years ago. Of course, any public scholarship, op-eds, blogs, other kinds of things. And then any kind of community awards that you may have won. A lot of times we are honored by our community for the work that we're doing with them. So any kind of community awards should be included. And then again, letters from your research partners, if that makes sense for you, given who your partner is, letters that detail your impact. And there's some guidance in the ASA guidelines in the toolkit for what to tell your letter writers they could include, because this may be the first time they've written a letter like this. So it's good to let them know what's important, what they should include in their letters. So when you're teaching, again, both, right? Your traditional stuff you'd include in your teaching, and then to enhance it for the community engagement side, again, who's your partner? What's the mission? What was the extent of the partnership for students? What was the evidence of impact? If you're including community engagement in your teaching, what's the evidence of impact for your partners? And what's the evidence of impact for your students? How can you characterize what your students got out of participating in this community engagement through their classes? On our campus, we actually survey our students, and we keep track of them across all of our engaged classes. And I presented at ASA last summer, we do research to understand what the impact is of this work on our students. And what we find is that our students feel much more connected to their peers, they feel much more connected to the professor, and they feel much more connected to the community. And it helps them to see routes that they could take in terms of social change in the future. So it helps them in lots of different ways, curricularly and interpersonally. One thing that I do in my teaching statement, is I am explicit in saying this class is like teaching a new prep every single year, because I have new partners and new approaches, and just to make it really clear that you're not just pulling this syllabus off the shelf the same way every year, because every year, if you're teaching with a community partner, it's something totally different. Could be a completely different topic, different partner, different approach, different project, right? And so you need to describe the amount of work you put into creating this wonderful learning environment for students. Again, if you're mentoring grads or undergrads through the process, that's important to mention as part of your teaching, and your community impact letters, if that makes sense. And then finally, service is hard because that's where we always used to put it. We used to put all of our community engagement work in service, and now we're saying, no, don't put it in there, but you still need something in service. So I would say we're all doing service in our departments and at our universities and professionally, and that all counts, really heavily. If you want to include your work in the community also as your service, I would say, think about it as the service to the community that goes above and beyond what you're doing in your teaching or research. Maybe you've been asked to join a board, for instance, or maybe there's an annual event that you go to here in Santa Cruz, I'm thinking of Stuff the Bus, where people pack backpacks for school children at the beginning of the school year, right? That kind of thing that's not really aligned to your research portfolio, but is partnership building activity, you could put in your service statement. And then, the impact of that service, what that would have in the community. It's not double dipping to list your work with the community in more than one place. That's our perspective. That's not double dipping. However, you don't know how other people are going to read your file. And so I just urge you to think about how you can differentiate what you're calling service from what you're calling research and teaching activity. Your community partners can write you a letter, and again, consider if this would be a burden on them, an undue burden, before you ask. Make sure you do talk to your department chair, or who's ever running your personnel file, to make sure it's not counted as service. When I came up for full professor, my community impact letters, which were definitely research impact letters, showed up as my service letters in my file, which is normal. That's how it used to be done. Now we know a better way, and we have guidelines to tell us that. But some guidance that you can give them is like, how did this professor collaborate with you with you and your assessment of the depth and the quality of the relationship, how it helped move forward with some kind of policy or practice or fundraising or other goals that the organization had, the role of this scholarship in supporting DEI, if that's something you can do at your university. Maybe this is not something you can do at your university, and that's okay too. And then the impact of your scholarship, sort of beyond the original intent. Often our community partners are the ones who know how your research was used to advance policy, let's say at the county level or at the state level, things that you may not even know because they're in different networks than you are. And so if they could write about that too, just the broader impact of your work. I'm going to end there, and we can open up for questions, but I'm always happy to support people. If you have specific questions, here's my email address. Feel free to shoot me an email if we can't get your question answered during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Mark and Rebecca. That was really helpful. I'd like to open it up for Q&A now. So if anybody has a question, you can use the hand raising reaction, or you can go ahead and just type it into the chat. I can start with a question. Rebecca, this is for you because you've been on a campus that didn't have these guidelines, and then they now have these guidelines. Did you notice, or have you noticed, any discernible change in how either people's success or how people who are evaluating these portfolios go about looking at community engaged research as a result of these guidelines?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, the policy is only as good as its implementation, right? We can have the guidelines, and if people aren't using them or don't know what to do with them, then we haven't succeeded. I think it's going to take a little bit of time for all of the players to understand how to use these guidelines. And so this academic year is actually the first full academic year where people knew about the guidelines in time to put them in their personal statements before everything got sent up through the chain of, review. And what I'm hearing is that there is some confusion about, on the part of people who are submitting, what goes into which section, and on the part of the reviewers, then how to evaluate that. So I have heard that, we're having a few implementation bumps. That does not concern me. It's what I would expect. Having been a policy researcher for many years, I know that new things take a little while to calm down. But I think what that tells us is that we can't just be happy once we've passed these guidelines. Like we do, there's still a lot of work to do to make sure that they're being used.
Thank you. Greg.
A question. First of all, I want to commend you for getting this toolkit passed by the ASA. We should not underestimate how significant a change that is. And Rebecca, I know you and Mark and many others were responsible for this, and I'm envious because I was part of many failed efforts to do what you've accomplished. Um, but it seems to me that while it's important for candidates to use this toolkit, it's even more important to get departments to get this toolkit, to read it, to understand it, and to support it. Because it doesn't do a candidate any good if their department doesn't understand what this is all about, or if their department doesn't understand that the ASA is actually supportive of this as important scholarly work. So I guess what can we do, more importantly, what can the ASA do to get departments to understand something they have tried very hard not to understand for decades, so that it will change the way people are evaluated going forward?
Yeah. Well, I do thank you, Greg. And I'm not sure, I'm sure that, Rebecca has done a wonderful job. I'm not sure that the job that I've contributed or that what, a lot of people have tried over a number of years. And I think that, however, we've tried recently, it is also because there has been this groundswell and this change that's occurred to make the ASA and council and sociologists more generally open to this. But I do think you're right that in the end, the toolkit and the guidelines are a tool to help promote understanding and acceptance and action at the department. First of all, at the department level, but also going up through the university, because eventually, most times deans and provosts also have a say in tenure and promotion. And I would like to also mention that what's happening in sociology here with tenure and promotion is not limited to sociology. Many other disciplines are also talking about and adopting similar kinds of guidelines. I would say they tend to follow in a little bit more, leaning more, a little bit more to public scholarship as opposed to specifically community engaged scholarship, but it's happening, across disciplines. So, I think the change has got to occur in the understanding of faculty at the department level. And so we are this year in the Sociology Action Network trying to roll out a kind of dissemination and engagement plan where we will, first of all, make people more aware that these guidelines actually even exist to be used, and then to promote, conversations and discussions with faculty, across different roles. I mean, we had a workshop at ASA, we had a pavilion talk at ASA, we're having this webinar, we're going to do another, the SAN is going to do another recorded webinar, and I think we have lots of ideas about how to do that. I think it's going to be a bottom up and top down thing. Well, not that this is top down exactly, but some change at a national association level then, opens up opportunities at the ground level. So, but I will say also, though, Greg, that I do think things have really shifted. And I would say 20 or 30 years ago, departments were trying very hard not to do this. I think now, I mean, my sense of it varies, obviously, but my sense of it is that there's a lot more openness. And part of the issue is more just like, how do we do it? Not really understanding it, but more open to it than people used to be. So, that still speaks to the need to educate people, but it's a little less about the advocacy of it. I know you and I actually co-wrote an article about this that was much more advocacy oriented. We have to convince people of the value of the knowledge that's being produced through these methods. And I think there's more openness to that now. And but yes, but I think that's the important question. Will the faculty receive this well? But I do want to say, just in case this has not been clear, if you are a candidate, we encourage you right in your statement to reference these guidelines. Like, state right there, the American Sociological Association has issued guidelines to include community engaged scholarship, which is what I do. And here, and there's a link to the guidelines, and Rebecca's given you a number of things that you can lift right out of the guidelines or the toolkit and then apply them directly to your work. If that's helpful resource to you, then I would say you should go right ahead and do that. And similarly, I think personnel committee members who are open to this can also explicitly cite the guidelines as the way they are going about valuing and incorporating it in their reports. So.
Yeah, just to add real quick, and thanks, Greg. I don't think we'd be here today if you hadn't laid the groundwork all those years ago. One of our colleagues on the Sociology Action Network has talked about how difficult it is in her setting, where she's a professor. It's a conservative town in a conservative state, to even include her community engagement in her file. And so I would say, for those of you who are in places that you think are hostile to your research topic or your research approach, the guidance we have is to know your local context, and do what feels right in that context. To the extent that these guidelines can help you to say, this is a valued approach in my discipline, please deploy them that way. If in your context that will put you at risk, we would encourage you to act in your best interests, whatever they are.
Lori.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you to both presenters. I'm at Penn State, and I'm a part of a committee, as a part of actually the WT grant, Institutional Challenge Grant, to really think about, institutional change around this topic. And, I had a similar question to Greg's. Really just thinking, Rebecca, when you were presenting, you were talking about the basics of scholarship, all those sort of metrics that we want people to achieve will be the same. But we all know how much harder this work is to do and how much longer it is than, I think about when I do secondary data analysis, it's just me and my computer, and I can turn those things out very quickly. I'm just wondering if on the institutional side or even at the departmental committee level, if you've been able to impact just the idea that, perhaps someone who's going up for associate who has 40 papers, may look very different than a community engaged researcher who might have 25. And how do you compare the two when the work and the effort is just characteristically different?
I mean, for me, I lay it out as factual information. The work that went into this article, this book, included a partnership with a community organization, which necessarily takes time because you're building trust and you're attending community meetings and you're doing this and you're doing this, and that is all part of the research process. And so I would not ever say there are fewer outputs, but I would say each output requires like more of an effort, and because the partnership work underlying this is so important. And then of course you've got the community partner impact letter that also buffers that, and says, yes, this is very impactful for us. So I think it's really important just to educate the people who are reviewing the file and saying, because they're thinking maybe like the last person we reviewed had 40 papers, and this, I mean, no, I don't know, 40 papers seems like so many, but maybe at Penn State, you guys are very productive. That the last person had 40, why does this person only have 25? And, it's just like if you're doing ethnographic work, you have to really explain how painstaking and careful you are in making sure that you've got those relationships strongly based. So I think just really be upfront. This is how much time it takes. Every class I do is a new prep, right? That you just have to really educate people. We may be doing that for a decade before it finally sinks in. We may need to keep doing that over and over and over again. And I guess I wouldn't shy away from that. Don't assume people understand.
I'll just add briefly, there's also a comment in the chat about related. I think we are also, well, first of all, this is not a new thing in the sense that, like, I do qualitative research, and qualitative research also, because I have to collect my own data, and some people who do quantitative research do not collect their own data. So, in many ways, qualitative sociologists are in the position of taking more time and different kinds of efforts to produce what might end up being, quote unquote, fewer publications. But the other point, so I think these are all things that have to be worked out, and it's not a new issue. But the second thing is, we also are saying in these guidelines that these products that are not necessarily peer reviewed, but are reports or blogs or whatever, should be valued as research products, right? So like we don't get into a number, we can't really get into a numbers game around this, or how many of one and how many of the other, and how do you, but we are insisting, at least trying to insist in the guidelines that they are. And this comes back to that sort of deeper question I think that Greg was raising too about a transformation in the understanding of sociologists across the board, that there are different ways of producing knowledge and different kinds of knowledge that are produced that have value, and that peer-reviewed publications are one important way, but not the only one. So, and then I think there's a question about, well, do we have examples of that that would help? So I think that's a good suggestion. And I know that we have talked in the Sociology Action Network about doing some profiles of candidates who have come up to kind of give people examples. And maybe should we do that, we could also include some of the examples of their products, and maybe that would be helpful. But it's a good question, and I think will need to think about like how we could be supportive of that.
Thank you. And even though I'm moderating, I'm going to jump in because Rebecca coached me through my promotion to full. So I feel like this is coming in part from Rebecca. It was before these guidelines were here, but one thing to answer Lori's question that she was able to do was to write me a letter to speak as an expert. And I was able to say, okay, here are the things like I did a huge report that had to be internal for an organization because they were setting their legislative priorities, right? So I was able to say, here are the things I think might not be seen as research. Can you write me a letter of support as an external letter writer that can talk to these? And Rebecca was able to explain this takes more time. Though this is not peer reviewed, it rises to the level. So it's unfortunate that sometimes we have to do more, but hopefully some of that gets a little bit eased now that some people can say themselves, look, there's these guidelines. So maybe you don't have to get as many external letters to say maybe this takes more time. We're coming up towards the top of the hour. Stephanie has her hand up. So let's have Stephanie ask our final question of the webinar.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical issues. Hopefully it comes through. Rebecca, thanks so much for all this really helpful information. I'm one of the relatively newer colleagues on your UC-wide network from UCI. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between working out guidelines and how this might be implemented at the disciplinary or school level and the campus-wide institutional level of like generic academic personnel policy, because I'm having both of those conversations right now, and I'm wondering what that looks like at your institution and what you might suggest in terms of kind of, so to speak, bottom up or top down for trying to work on this culture change. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. And just so you know, Waleed Afifi, who's from UC Santa Barbara and also on the leadership team of the UC-wide Community Engagement Network, is on this webinar. I feel lucky because there was a confluence of things that happened on my campus that at the same time led to us, like, this was the moment to do it, and we did it. But one of those things was that I invited our then Vice Provost for Academic Affairs to join the committee, the UC-wide Community Engagement Network. He comes from statistics, and he hadn't had really any experience with community engagement before. But we had a dean on our campus, a new dean who was really public humanities and was just like really kind of pushing it a little bit. There were some people on our academic personnel committee that were like ready. And so he took a year and learned and listened and learned and joined a group of people who were talking about this work. And that's what pushed us forward, was his openness and willingness. I don't know, if that happens everywhere on every campus. My guess is no. I feel lucky that I had that leadership support. But he's now my dean of social sciences. He stepped down. I feel like we should get our UC, like if you have a network, get your administrators together to talk about these issues. I know that they meet. So if there's if there's a campus in the network that you're in that seems to have made these things happen, take advantage of that and be like, well, so-and-so's done it, or my discipline has done it, right? And nobody likes to be left behind. Campus leaders like to be in the forefront. They don't like to be the last ones to do something. So, if you can take advantage of that eagerness to be the leader, I would do that. But Stephanie, if you want to follow up, I can put you in touch with our guy, and he's super nice, and I'm sure he'd be happy to chat.
Thank you.
We are at the top of the hour. I will be sending this recording out to everyone who registered right away, and then we'll find a way to put it online later so that maybe you can use it to share with your colleagues to start changing some of the culture around this in your own departments. But please remember that we have those guidelines and we've got 2 minutes left. So I would like to just hand it back to Rebecca and Mark if you have any last words that you want to say to end today's webinar.
Just thanks, everyone. It's an exciting moment, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in, the next decade as we really roll these out.
Yeah, and thank you, Carol, for hosting this and sponsoring this. I do think, just as far as the last comment goes too, I think we have to think about this as a movement. And, there's going to be different pieces and it's going to move in different ways. And we're doing a piece of it right here. And it's a very important piece. It's not all of it. But it has to happen in other disciplines. It has to percolate to the higher levels of universities. But I do feel I travel around a lot, and lots of places I go now, all of a sudden, here's the special assistant to the dean for community engaged scholarship at this university, and here's the vice president for community engaged scholarship at some other place. So, I feel like there is a groundswell going on, and we just met with Shelley Carell, the incoming president of the American Sociological Association, is very interested in solutions-oriented sociology, very interested in community engaged scholarship, talking about having a featured special session at the annual meeting next year that will promote this specific work, but the broader vision of this work. So I'm just excited to be at this moment that I think myself and many people on this call, Greg and Rebecca and Carol, been working for a long time. So let's try to move it forward, and wherever we are located, let's try to do our piece to move what we can forward.
Thank you. And with that, I hope you all have a good end of the week and a fabulous weekend. Thank you so much for coming and for all the work that all of you are doing. Bye.
Thanks, Carol.
Thank you. Bye-bye.